Last time I mentioned the war in Afghanistan is connected to this broader Bush-era rhetoric of the war on terror. It is, of course, however, important to recognize that the United States federal government also invaded Iraq during the course of this period, completely disconnected from war on terror rhetoric. So think to yourself for a moment, what was the justification for the United States, arguably from the perspective of the Department of Defense in terms of that invasion? It's a bit of a brainstorming question. What motivations were there? You could come up with several possibilities. What was the suggestion of evidence? Was there any actual evidence? And how did this impact the broader climate at the time? There is no doubt that unlike the case of the US invasion of Afghanistan, which was already a muddled situation that quickly became a quagmire, the US invasion of Iraq was actually warned against by Bush Sr. and then followed up upon by Bush Jr. Nonetheless, the case is quite different because the United States claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but presented no discernible evidence to the United Nations that there were any. Nonetheless, Colin Powell and others, in fact, produced claims that they had evidence when in fact they did not, suggesting that somebody in military intelligence in the United States actually fabricated evidence. Do we know who? No. Such information has not been declassified. Nonetheless, we do know that it happened. It's the only possible explanation from a sort of logical assessment of the available details. Nonetheless, moving forward, these two conflicts and then growing conflicts across southwestern Asia and this persistent war on terror rhetoric, the justification of the Patriot Act, and so forth, create a very specific social climate in the United States where there is a growing sense of Islamophobia that sweeps across the nation. Within that context, have a look at this photo. Do you recognize any of the images here? Any of the people? Most folks would probably recognize perhaps an older picture or a more aged picture of the woman on the left, currently Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. But most probably would not recognize the person on the right, Representative Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison, a congressman from Minnesota, was in fact the first Muslim to be elected to Congress in the United States. This occurred in the broader context of Islamophobia, or a term that means, by definition, sort of people who are expressing Islamophobia have some sort of fear or hatred or prejudice against people who are Muslims more generally, especially seen as a sort of geopolitical force. Quite comparable in this sense to anti-Semitism. The term was first used in the early 20th century, and it emerged as a neologism more clearly in the 1970s. It's a very important term for understanding this period of US history. In mid-November of 2006, it was reported that Keith Ellison was the first Muslim ever elected to the United States Congress as a representative from Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. In fact, the seat is now held by Representative Ilhan Omar, who took the seat quite decisively in an election when Keith Ellison moved on to other occupations. This particular seat was not very much contested during Ellison's initial election. However, it caught national attention because of Ellison's intention to take his oath of office with his hand on the Quran. Now, this is very important. When congressional representatives take their oath of office, in fact, the pictures that you see, such as this picture right here, that's just a photo op. It's not the ceremony. During their swearing in of the ceremony, you just get all the new people to stand up all at the same time. Whoop, new people stand up, take the oath, new people sit down, continue with business. Generally speaking, because there are a lot of new representatives and it takes too much time to swear in everybody at once. So just boom, stand up, take the oath, swear in, sit down, do your photo op later on your own time. So note that the photo op itself in this swearing in where people have their hand on something, it's not a formal ceremony to begin with. Nonetheless, dissent ensues. In reaction to the news, conservative media pundit Dennis Prager criticized the decision in November 28, 2006, titled, "America, Not Keith Ellison, Decides What Book a Congressman Takes His Oath On." The column attracted national attention from supporters of both Ellison and Prager, creating a debate. Presented with the fact that all members of the House swear in or affirm you don't actually legally have to swear on anything en masse without the use of any religious text, and that such works were only used in this ceremonial reenactments afterwards, Prager stated that's the whole point. It's because it's ceremonial that it matters. The controversy became more heated when Representative Virgil Goode, a Republican of Virginia, issued a letter to his constituents stating his beliefs that Ellison's decision to use the Quran was inherently a threat, quote, to the values and beliefs traditional in the United States of America, and if American citizens don't wake up, we may adopt the Virgil Goode position on immigration, there will likely be many more Muslims elected to office and demanding the use of the Quran. Never mind, of course, that hypothetically, the use of the Quran was actually guaranteed under the Constitution in this case. Nonetheless, in response, former New York City Mayor Ed Koch called for Prager to end his service on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Council. The argument that Koch and others used against Prager was that they could not support an argument that was actually being floated quite similar to the religious prejudices of the past that resulted in the Holocaust, a singeing criticism of Prager. The argument from Koch and others was that anyone who could not support Ellison was not interested in the First Amendment and would be in a standing violation of the U.S. Constitution. Within congressional circles, this led to the ostracism of several individuals such as Ray Moore, who had proclaimed in violation of U.S. constitutional law that no Muslim should serve in Congress, his words, direct quote. Consequently, eventually, Keith Ellison does actually swear in, even in an informal photograph, on a Quran. The particular Quran that he uses, of course, is, if you could recognize it, you would know it's quite notable. The Quran is not usually in 2 volumes. This Quran happens to be a Library of Congress prize possession. It is the Quran of Thomas Jefferson. It's a Quran that Thomas Jefferson actually had translated so that he could ensure that he could study it and understand the perspective of Muslims for the sake of diplomacy and other measures. More broadly, the context of Islamophobia in the United States is relatively notable in the increased organization of anti-Muslim groups over time. There was a substantial jump between 2015 and 2016 and a continuous growth from 2016 onwards, according to statistics from the FBI and other federal organizations of anti-Muslim groups in the United States. In fact, if you compare certain data from the FBI, what you're looking at here is actually a map of FBI extremist murders in the United States. And the map is from a contemporaneous period of the period that we're discussing, from a single year, right? You might notice, for example, there's a famous nightclub series of murders that occur in Miami There was a famous series of murders that occurred in Missouri, right? One in San Francisco, so a couple data points there. Now this map, however, would be white supremacist events, white supremacist propaganda, violent extremist murders, and so forth under white supremacist groups over the course of the same period. Nonetheless, in 2016, the federal government actually cut funding for the de-radicalization of white supremacist groups in the United States. And that funding was later put back in the federal budget to a certain extent by Congress, but there's been sort of debates of freezing and unfreezing the funding ever since. Nonetheless, there's a contemporary climate which has been reflected upon by many artists in the United States, including Anita U. Ali. So I will put a video by Anita U. Ali for you to watch and comment upon moving forward. For your post, please take note of this climate and the content of the video.